That some people here are not very happy to hear outcomes at all, but we are in a kind of process to giving this outcomes. So there's still more to come. So it's clear it's just a wrap-up of the main outcomes until now. Or as I call it, it's what I think, what I understood, or not understood of what was said. For me, I had the feeling it was a lot about music. Yeah, I don't know why, but I heard music all the time with a lot of interventions. There were a lot of people referring to music. So the first time when it came to my mind, it was about mixed remark about the power. We've got the power. And then I thought, what is the soundtrack of this seminar? And I found some good things here, yeah? So we have expect the unexpected. And it's about kind of education. What kind of education do we need? We don't need no education. We've got the power. We also have the words. Because it was a lot about words, and I will come back to this approach about words again. It's about changes. And there was something about support and help. I thought how would help sound if it was not with help, but with support. You can try it yourself. I will not start singing, I promise. But it's also about thinking and not about so much action. So there's Aretha Franklin. We've got the importance of time. We've got again words, more than words. And that leads to extremism as well, because it's from extreme, so that's not bad. We've got new radicals, that's for Pauline, to get radical changes. I learned about superpowers that are needed in youth work. I was surprised about that, but that's a real new one. And go back to the real music. That's an instrumentalist. Joe Satriani was the extremist. So I was thinking about what was this whole stuff about. So it was about reflections. What is reflections? What does reflection mean? It's to think about. It's a kind of consideration. So we should reflect on the different expectations what people have on youth work. Yeah. We also have to, it's kind of introspection, so we should have a look at ourselves to see what we expect of that things and the expectations. What are expectations? It's kind of belief. It's a belief that something will happen or is likely to happen. But it's nothing else but a belief. Yeah? So if you expect something, it does not mean that anything of that should happen. It's just likely to be happening. That's it. It's also an anticipation. We want to reach something, but we are not really sure if we will. We also were already in the beginning talking about youth work, and it was mentioned in the opening speeches already that there are different understandings, different national, cultural realities for youth work, for the setting of youth work, for the support of youth work. It's also about Europe. So what are we talking about here? Very often I had the feeling we were talking about the European Union, which is not just the only setting existing here. Yeah? We are also talking about the Council of Europe. We are talking about the states. We were talking a lot about the member states of these two organizations. We were even talking about regions inside of Europe. Yeah, now we learned about the regional youth research network that spreads out over Europe. So it's a lot of different things here, and one thing is it's about open, which is not in the title, yeah, which is quite interesting. Yeah, it's not about open youth work. It's the expectations of youth work in Europe. But open, for me, the first thing that came to my mind was the description that young people don't have to be there at open youth work. That was the description given more or less by Philip by saying that the difference to his kind of youth work he's doing now is that they have to be there. So the difference would be they don't have to be there for open youth work, which is an interesting approach. So we are doing something for people that don't have to be there. So back to music, begin. And the first introduction was, feel free to speak and listen to each other. I hope that worked out. I was more listening. I did not talk a lot. Now you have to listen to me. That's the revenge for that. And it was also mentioned that we should be clear that we have to show the benefit of youth work to policymakers, but also to the young people. Because very often we have to provide a benefit. They don't see the benefit by itself. You remember the story that was presented on the first day by Duke, if I remember the name correctly. And he also reminded us it's about taking young people seriously. Do you remember the story he told that he was meeting some important guy from South America and he had some drinks together, but he could not remember? That's good, because if you remember it, you were not there. That's a typical saying for young people, so it seems that he was taken seriously, or at least he took it seriously. We also had some introduction about ACA and Eurodesk, which was for me a quite interesting approach, because both of these were focusing a lot about opportunities for mobility. So not about the need for mobility for young people, which is a task that we see very often nowadays in the European youth policy. Here it is about opportunities for young people to be mobile, and it's more about informing young people about opportunities. It's quite interesting how many steps we can go back, and they were also reminding us that there are a lot of possible synergies inside the countries. So it's not always about making networks work only on the European level. You also have member organizations in the countries that you can approach, and that is something that we should not forget. So Mark gave the first sum up of the results of the big R. And you remember there were the young people sitting around the tables giving some explanations of the different stuff, what they meant with the 5 main topics, encouraging young people, and we heard some of those. I was going around from table to table and got some impressions what they meant, and I thought some of them are really extraordinary. So when we talk about encouraging young people, it's not a thing that young people expect youth workers to encourage them all the time. It's not, that's really annoying. It is, if we approach them, that's what the young person said, if we approach them, then we expect to be encouraged. So there's no second chance. If we fail to encourage the young people, they will be gone. But it's not something that we have to encourage them all the time. We just have to be ready at exactly that moment. Another thing is the safe environment for experiment. And here it was mentioned that one of the people said he thinks the biggest challenge for experimenting and feeling unsecure is the own person's insecurity. It's not so much about being really unsafe environment. It's more about not feeling apt to do something, which is quite a constructivistic approach. It's really good. To help them, to support them, so when we need the support for reaching the goals, even it was not mentioned if the goals were set by the young people or by others, but they said when we need support, then we want to have the support and get help. It was a talk about creative positive experiences, and it was mentioned that some people never experienced anything of a kind of success before. For me, it is quite a difficult stuff, Is it the task of youth work to enable success? Is it the task of youth work to provide success, the feeling of success? I guess it's quite a difficult task to do that. To get somebody not to fail. but it's also about the other thing, to get appreciated, yeah? To get good contacts. So maybe it's not so high, the level is not so high. And there was a discussion about what is meant with space, give people the space. And as far as I understood it, it's firstly the space just to be there, to have space, to meet, to be around. And only in the second phase it would be space and room for decision making, so asking for the power. So we are really one step before that. Okay, Philip reminded us that it's social work is, and youth work is always a kind of social work. I had the feeling it's like the call for the Horizon 2020 research projects. Young people as actors of social change. Here it would be youth work as actor of social change, and it's an interesting thought behind it, because when we think that youth work as an entity, let's call it an entity, is striving for a social change, then we can say that youth workers have expectations, yeah? And for this youth work, and it might be to change the people or to change the situation. And that was also brought up by Philip quite clearly. Are we working with the people and are really concentrated on the individual approach, or are we trying to change the situation they are living in and enable experiences for them? That's really a question about direction of youth work. And it's about distribution, redistribution of chances in life. He also mentioned in some place it's for non-organized or marginalized young people. And for me it was immediately the question, are they always the same? Is non-organized all the time the same as marginalized? We find more and more young people that are not organized in any youth organization but coming from the middle class. And we have to think about, is youth work, as we understand it, an open youth work, is it going for this target group? It is open for them, but are they targeting on them? When we are asking for a social change, are we still targeting on middle class young people that are not organized? I think that's worth thinking about to find their own place. He also asked about revision of society, more or less a reinvention of the social, and thus he would ask for the review of social work in post-communist, in post-colonial, in post-welfare, and I would say in post-optimistic times. So what are we doing here? And yesterday the question came up, how would it be in the post-neoliberal times? Which is quite an interesting approach, because we were joking in Vienna sometimes ago when playing cards, we're saying, well, after that second, third modernity, we are back in the Caliphate anyway. So how will youth work look there? But that's really not a good joke. Okay. Maurice gave us some connections between the youth policy development and youth work development, and the different connections. And he was, one of the first sentences he said, it was to say, to take the responsibility for ourselves. And the opportunities have been provided like never before. But you have to know these opportunities that you have in your work. And he didn't mean programs like Erasmus+. He was really talking about definition and descriptions of youth work, political descriptions of youth work, that they are so broad that almost everything fits. Yeah, so you can really go for it and say, you need that. He also reminded me, at least, to say that we do have a very young history of European Union youth policy. It's more or less 15 years old, and as you know, and as I know, some 15 years olds are quite difficult. So maybe give them some more time to find out what comes. He also mentioned that many of the contributions for youth policy nowadays come from youth work, but still a lot of youth workers are not happy with how youth policy looks like, which is quite interesting. So it leads to the question about participation and having a voice of youth inside the youth work community that influences youth policy. So who are those people from youth work that obviously are influencing youth policy? I guess that's a quite interesting question. Do we know them? Yeah? Well, some of us do, yeah, but why are we still so unhappy with this development that comes in? Are we unhappy with our own way of getting involved in policy making? Are we unhappy with the compromise? Or do we just think, oh, it's the wrong people that are involved? And another task was perceived by Maurice about saying that the economic crisis really made new challenges for young people in growing up. Yeah? And for me, that sounded like, he did not say it, but for me it sounded like that there is a new task for youth work, a new one. And that was to enable young people to face the crisis. That he said, enable young people to face the crisis. I don't know what that means. I really don't. I did not understand what can be done because all of us are facing the crisis. And we can do it because we have to. What is the task of youth work now? To change the crisis? Should young people change the crisis? That's something that I hear very often. Yeah, we go for the youth guarantee. Like in Spain, the youth guarantee goes more into the direction of entrepreneurship. So if you don't have jobs, create your own jobs. And if you don't manage to, then it's your fault. And you failed, not the policymakers, not the economy. It's just your personal failure. So that's quite an interesting thing. If something like that is defined, do we take this task and how do we, as social workers, as youth researchers, how do we define this task? What does it mean, enable young people to face the crisis? Graham was talking about the yin and yang of political text, that he was preparing for the meetings, go for the yin all the time and always ignore the yang. Well, that's quite interesting. You're doing youth work and you're ignoring the yang. Well, that's yeah, I guess so. And what I learned is process beats outcomes, at least for you. So we are all asked to use the hashtag process project. And youth work is always defined as a process. You were also mentioning that thinking already is action, and we should not stop thinking about it. And I would go a step further, and I would say doing is very often not action, because it's reaction. Very often we are doing something because we are forced to do it. Now do something, we cannot really think about it. And we are just reacting, and we are always behind. We are never setting the speed or never setting the direction. And that's why thinking is action. He also reminded us of the importance of time. Are we talking about youth work for the now or for the future? Is it something to change young people, to prepare them to be? That's an interesting thing, because as far as I understood, Graham meant that policymakers force educationalists, educators, youth workers, teachers to focus more and more on the future of young people and not on the present, how they are living, how they are doing, which is quite interesting, because one of the main critiques on policymakers we see nowadays is that they are never focusing on the future but always thinking about the now and the next 4 years when there are the next elections. So it's really interesting to see people here, they are asked to think about the future for the 15 years time. When young people leave this education system, they should find a good job, but at that time the policymakers are not here anymore. Quite interesting.
That's that everybody's reading.
Yeah. So this neoliberal approach is everywhere. He was talking about creativity. I'm also working a lot about creativity, and very often see, and that's also in creativity research, we see that the typical forms of education do not fit with creating something, because we always know what comes out. When we are talking about creativity, we have to be open enough to accept the changes that come out. And this is something that's, especially with school teachers, is very, very difficult. You know, to say, yeah, everything is okay, if there is something. You know. And he ended with this: social work is moral work, is ethical, is political, is democratic work. And food for thought, I think. We also learned, and this is something that I really like, problems are part of the deal. Yeah, Judith said that, because growing up means to have problems. It's always like that. Things go bad, they go wrong, it always goes wrong. That's how she formulated it. So it's really a pessimistic approach, so better not be young, because it's failure at all the time. She also reminded us that all of us want the kind of welfare state, but the people should be in charge of the definition of the welfare state by themselves. And they should do it themselves, which is quite an interesting approach. It's really a neoliberal approach, and I have the feeling that we really go more and more into that direction everywhere. So we want to have all these offers, but no one wants to pay for them. Yeah? So we have to do them ourselves, but we don't call them self-organized stuff anymore. Being young means being in between, and that's how I interpret it, being in between two safe sides. So it's, you know what you are when you're a child, and you know what you are when you're an adult. Who is adult? I mean, here. Okay, so you know what it is. Yes. Oh, that's good, because that maybe I'm still not. I still feel that's quite an interesting thing for me, because it seems to use end some time, and then we are there. And then nothing else is needed anymore for changing. Yeah? So that's quite an interesting thing for me. It is, what about lifelong learning? What about all that stuff? What about identity creation for the rest of our lives? Yeah? And changing all the time. So I guess many of our problems are not over when we reach a certain age. At least not when we are turning 23. Okay, for me I'm always describing young people, and that's also why we have this preventive approach in youth work very long. Young people are having the problems. We don't have problems. We adults don't have problems. The only problems we have are those made by young people. Yeah, normally by our own children or so. That's the only problems we have. We don't have any others. So being young means having problems and making problems. And the adults and also the youth workers, we know how to solve them. Well, we do, yeah, for sure. Okay. I had some other questions about our, it was this concept of youth organization, or organizing youth, was for me the question, where do we intervene, the adults at all, not only youth workers, where do adults intervene? Where are the borders of intervention? When is it good? When is it not good to intervene? Is it good to help people that are bullied? Yeah, for sure, from a pedagogical, from a psychological way. Is it good for the group context? I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah, in this concept of youth organizing. And it was mentioned that the relationship is important, that in the end it always goes back to the person of the youth worker. And I would say that's true. We know out of a lot of research that is done in formal education about the success of young people in schools, and with different variables that influence this success. And when you put all this research together, the most influential variable is the teacher. And I fear the most influential variable for successful youth work is the youth worker. I fear because then we have to think about how to train them a lot more than we do about the training. We know that we are training people for different things that are needed. Is it unpaid? Is it not enough funded? Yeah, clear. But what is unprofessional youth work? What makes youth work unprofessional? That's quite an interesting question. I think that's really something that people should think about. We were talking about the concept of openness. Open to change was one concept. I thought that quite interesting. Who can change this concept? Who can change the outcomes? Who can change the process? So, who is intervening? Who can make this change? How open are we? How honest are we? Is it accessible? Approachable? Is it the work to open up? And where is the difference to other pedagogical approaches then? I thought that for me there were quite some good points for further discussion. We were also talking about youth, especially when Judith gave her presentation with the graphic. I thought, well, that's quite interesting. When we are talking about youth work, which youth groups are we working with? I heard it from Belgium that we are talking from 3 to 30 with the same approach. I hope not. Yeah, that's something that is different. It's also about what is definition. When are people young or when are they not adult? And if they are adult, are they allowed to come or not? I think that's also an interesting question. So if somebody feels too adult and too mature, do we throw them out? Because we are not here for them anymore. It's about diversity. We don't have one youth. It's about demographic change and the youth cult in society, because none of us is old. You know, we are always young the rest of our lives. Well, we have to because we are professional young people, but more people than youth workers are staying young all the time. We were talking about work. What is meant with work? Is it a vocation? Do you hear the voice in yourself to say you have to do that? Why do so many people change then after 10 years of youth work? Is it about training? Is it about funding? So we had other words. It's about contesting. What is meant with contesting? Do we have to contest? Do young people have to contest us all the time? I think that's quite an interesting thing. Yeah? Not only to contest society, but also always question about what we are doing, how we are working with them. It's about activating. Activating to what? What we know is good leisure time activities. Yeah, that's something that's really, you use the word in one of the discussion rooms, differently activated. Motivated, yeah, that's very good. What we are talking about education, what do we mean with education? We are talking about dialogue. Dialogue is not only talking, it's also about the ability to listen to people and to react on that. It was about development. And for me, it was about this development phase, about a culture where everybody wants to stay young. We're developing and growing up, but still stay young and fall back to being childish and behave strangely. It's about multiculturalism. There was a lot of talk about that. I really do think there's a big misunderstanding about what multiculturalism means. You know, so I guess what we are doing normally is intercultural work and not multicultural work. You know, because we are working with the cultures and not just separate them and work with them in the one side. And we were talking about extremes. So what is extreme? It's always about definition. You know? For a lot of people, we had a case lately in Austria, yeah, when two lesbian young women were kissing in a coffee house and they were thrown out. And there was a big discussion. Yeah? And people were talking about that you can't behave that extreme. And you don't know what that means. Yeah? What is the extremity about it? Being lesbian, kissing in a coffee house before paying, I don't know. Yeah? So it's... And then we had some workshops, and the workshops were about training, they were about discourses, they were about extremism, they were about safety. And for me, when I was walking around and listening into the different workshops, there are some things that stick to my mind. And one was, okay, what we needed is the super wand, the super mouse. We need superpowers. I like that approach, to really see what skills are needed to do good youth work. Yeah? What superpower is needed. What skills, what knowledge, what values do we need to have as youth workers? And the question is, who defines them? Who has the power of definition? In the end, we are back to youth policy and youth work definition, and also the role of the young people themselves. So we are back to this magic triangle about the dialogue between these three defining actors. We were talking about the safety, and for me it became clear that here it's also about what is a safe place. It's also not clear defined. You know? We do not have a clear definition of it. It's also about the role of the family. It's also the peer pressure was mentioned. Also the peer control of behavior, but also the role of adults in both ways, I understood it. So as the safeguards, but also as the people that should be kept out. We were talking about narratives of open youth work in the different countries and the discourses, how they are dealt in the societies, and these also define the task and also the image of youth work. And this is something that, for me, came clearly out that we do have complete different realities, and it's very hard to work together here in a network. And it was also made clear that extremism is nothing new. There was also always extremism. The problem is that for some of us, these new forms of extremism we are talking about are so hard to understand, because they are going back to religion, and we have nothing to do with religion anymore. For others, it's not about the problem about the religion, but the wrong religion, because they do not see why it's not about that, why it's about fight. And for me came the idea, we always have to think about which forms of extremist ideas and ideologies do we want to suppress. And it's about us. It's about our definition, what we accept and what we can't accept. And we're not only talking about extremism, but talking about behavior of young people in the end. And that were, for me, the outcomes, and I hope you had a lot more. Thank you very much.